Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Michael Belzer, the author of Sweatshops on Wheels, Winners and Losers in Trucking Deregulation. I like that title, Sweatshops on Wheels, but actually that starts talking about some of the references you have in the book to sweated labor, and I think it might be helpful to review some of that literature.
Sure, the sweatshop story in the minds of most people is a very black and white, kind of a grainy photo sitting in front of a sewing machine. But in fact, it's a generalized way of organizing the production system. And that generalized way is consistent with a highly competitive economic environment with basically an unregulated world where labor is unregulated, wages are unregulated, hours of work are unregulated, prices unregulated. And that world was the world of the 19th century. It's the one that we know. It's the one that we look back to photos of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, things like that. But in fact, what I'm finding is the sweatshop has come back. It's come back not only in the Far East, as we know from the sweatshop campaigns that have been raised in the last few years, but right under our noses in the trucking industry. And I think that the trucking industry is a bellwether industry, and that it suggests that if we were to have that kind of competition everywhere in our economy, we should expect to see these sweatshops to develop.
Well, and when you talk about sweated labor, there's certain conditions you talk about or review in your book about low wages and long hours.
The most critical characteristic of the sweatshop is that it's in a highly competitive economic environment. And in that economic environment, which has no regulatory framework, essentially, with respect to the labor, the hours of work, and so forth, there develops a very competitive relationship among people who work in the industry. And they tend to compete in this race to the bottom, we call it, where they just work harder and work longer in order to make the last nickel that they make. And it's particularly characterized by contract labor. In the actual 19th century sweatshop typically was a subcontractor from a larger firm, and the larger firm would hire the subcontractors to produce the work, and then they would assemble it at the larger firm. And this is a structure which we are familiar with today. But in the sweated environment, you didn't have any breaks on number of hours of work that people could put in. You didn't have any inspectors to require that the workplaces be sanitary and be well equipped and be safe and so forth. And what we have in trucking now is a highly competitive environment where we have a lot of subcontracting, that is owner-operators, people who drive trucks that they own and are therefore considered businessmen, even though they really aren't independent. They're hired out to regular trucking companies. We also have piecework, and the piecework is an important part of the sweatshop system. That is, people are paid by the piece. They're paid by the piece of clothing that they make in the environment that we usually think about, or they're paid by the mile, as it is in trucking. The drivers, most of the time, are paid by the mile, or they're paid as a percentage of the revenue earned by the load. In most of the truckload sector of the industry, in the long haul area, they're not paid for their hours of work if the wheels aren't turning, and that's one of the big issues with them. So in sum, what we have here is low wages, long hours, unsafe and unsanitary conditions, all turned out by the same kind of economic system that we thought we were done with back in the 19th century, but in fact is back with a vengeance.
Well, in the 19th century, it got to be where the hours kept getting longer and longer and the pay less and less, and you had 12-hour days or longer, and child labor started coming into it. So, you know, it was a great advance forward when people started talking about 40-hour work weeks, but the truckers are starting to work those kind of mindless kinds of hours, and we'll get into that a little bit, but I think before we do, the book fascinated me from the first time I read about it in the Oxford catalog, and it was particularly because you've shared some, or it'd be helpful for our viewers if you shared some of your background and your research in the trucking industry. I mean, one time you were a truck driver yourself. So.
Oh, that's right. I've probably got about 750,000 miles of over-the-road trucking experience before I became a professor. So that doesn't mean that I just wrote about my experiences while I drove a truck, but as I looked into the hard data and started doing the research, I began to see some flaws in the existing data, places where clearly the data were not correct, that they were missing most of what's going on in our trucking industry. And I started asking a lot of questions, and we've done a lot of surveying and other work that helps substantiate the assertions that I've made, and basically we now see that we have a very difficult industry that creates a competitive environment which is perhaps unlike any others in our country. I'd say that my experience with driving the truck gave me the ability to, as they say in show business, know where the stumps are when you walk across the water. You kind of figure out where the secrets are behind the magic. And by doing so, I'm not as easily fooled, I think, as most people would be by the statements made and the data that show up in public data sets that turn out not to be very accurate.
Well, one of the surprises I had, and I guess it's my own reaction, is your book is really a pretty closely argued book in terms of economics and statistical analysis. And so it was quite interesting that way that you had, really gathered all this data together as you, were supporting your argument. I guess I expected, maybe more of a general argument or something based on a survey. So that made it really pretty interesting, but that also makes it more complex for us to discuss now, and yet it's important to do so, particularly because you argue in your book that the trucking industry has been transformed in the last 20 years from a profitable undertaking to one that promises to produce the first wave of sweated labor like we were talking about in America, and that has implications in other types of employment.
Well, I think that the trucking industry is a little different from the rest of the industries in the United States, and that's one of the reasons why it provides a good case study of this sweatshop problem, or the nature of work. Because people are paid on this piecework basis, they're very strongly driven to perform. This is an industry where people work very hard because that's the only way they're going to make a living. And there are all kinds of jobs where people are standing around and waiting for the next person to do the work, and that will never work with trucking because, again, if the wheels aren't turning, the truck driver is not making any money, and there's only one person to drive that truck, and that's that truck driver, and so that's what he's got to do. When we went out and collected data, we found that the hours of work and conditions of work had really deteriorated. In 1980, the United States had a regulated trucking system. We regulated the number of competitors, we regulated their rates, we regulated where they could compete, where they could haul the freight, and all kinds of things like that. And we also had almost an entirely unionized trucking industry. In 1980, probably 60 to 70% of all truck drivers were Teamsters, were members of the union. And as a result, they were pretty well taken care of. The job was reasonably good. But some things had fallen through the cracks over the years. For one thing, almost all workers in the United States are covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. That is, they get time and a half after 40 hours and they get a minimum wage. Well, technically, the trucking industry is covered by the minimum wage, but they're not covered by the 40-hour work week. So it's been customary for a long time for those drivers to work the legal limit or more, which is 60 hours approximately in a week. So when the trucking industry deregulated, when the government removed regulations from the trucking industry, there was no floor to fall to. Very quickly, the Teamsters lost their ability to represent most truck drivers, and most people became non-union. It was, if you remember, 1980 was a pretty tough time. 1980, 81, 82, 83, this was a very, very deep recession, the worst since the Great Depression. So that means labor was cheap. We call it a loose labor market. There was too many workers and too few jobs. And so a lot of people who were laid off from the auto industry, the steel industry, the farm equipment manufacturing industry, the farms themselves, all of those were in great uproar during that period of time, and that put a lot of people out of work, and those people would work for whatever they needed to get the job done. So what happened was they flooded into the labor market. They looked at this as a way to try to match their previous earnings from their old occupations, and they went to work. And because our ability to enforce the hours of service rules, there are regulations in the Department of Transportation that limit the number of hours that people can work to approximately 60 hours a week. But it's very unenforceable because they're just pieces of paper, self-reporting, and so forth. And there's tremendous economic pressures. So the drivers tended to begin to cheat on their logbooks, not mark down all of their work. After all, they weren't getting paid for any of their time while they were not turning any wheels. So, in fact, they had all the incentive in the world to log work time as off-duty so they could get more hours in the week. And the number of hours just have increased, and now the average is about 70 hours a week for an over-the-road driver. And that's the average. I have plenty of folks that are working 100 hours. At the 90th percentile, that is, the top 10% are working 96 hours and up per week.
Well, and that raises that question of safety, because I think in some people's mind they see these accidents where a truck just runs into a car or something, you know, or out of maybe fatigue or other factors. But certainly safety starts becoming an issue when you're working that many hours driving this huge machine.
Well, there's no question that you get very tired doing this job. In spite of all the flashy chrome and cushy seats and all the things that you see in the pictures, it's actually a pretty tough job. It's hard work. You're sitting in one place. The mortality rate is very high just from the lethargy, the fact that you're not getting any physical exercise, but you have to be totally alert and on the ball all the time, and you're working 12 to 14 hours a day. And as a result, this job tends to wear people down. I think the mortality rate is undoubtedly way higher. That is, their life expectancy is way lower than most workers in the United States. And they basically find themselves working so hard and so long that they certainly can get very tired. Now, we don't really know exactly what point after which, when you cross it, the people become unsafe. That part becomes very difficult to tell. But we do have other research, which is not reported in the book, but which we're working on now, that strongly suggests that the amount people are paid will have a lot to do with how safe they are. In fact, it looks like about a 1-to-1 relationship. That is, for every 1% increase in pay, there's a 1% decrease in crash. So
Wow.
the whole sweatshop environment and the intense level of work and the low pay tends to have a safety implication. It's very hard to put your fingers on exactly what's causing it, but you know that you're getting, if you pay less money, you're going to get a less qualified person, you're going to get a less desirable person behind the wheel, they're going to have less human capital, they won't bring the same incentives to the job, they won't feel like this job is really important and we don't want to lose this job. In fact, they might feel like, well, what's the difference? I'm going to make my money today and I'll let tomorrow worry about itself. That's not really good for the public.
This is sort of a side note, but is it accurate? My perception is that when you're driving on the big interstate tollways, that you see enormous amounts of trucks just pull off on the rest area, or both the ramp up to it there and the ramp off and other places. My impression is this is because they're really just taking a short rest and then on their way, or is this a work rule thing? Or
Oh, no. Work rules are probably a minor explanation for this. As a kind of a complicated story, before deregulation, the trucking industry itself was dominated by common carriers, most of which were regional and not national. There were really almost no transcontinental carriers, let alone national carriers. So the transformation over the last 20 years is just enormous. One of the things that happened was that in the old days, a driver would, even if it was a national company and the haul was a long haul, one driver typically would just take it for 500 miles or so and hand it off to another driver who would pick up that load and go back. So the farthest that an individual driver in one of these operations would run might well be that 500 miles away from home. He might go 500 miles to one city and then 500 miles to another city which was not home, but it was still one full shift of work that was always beginning and ending at a terminal. So you had a home base and you came back to your home base. You might be gone for a couple of days, but you had a regular schedule and you'd be back reasonably quickly. In today's environment, when all of that general freight was lost by the general freight common carriers, it was picked up by much lower cost operators in this new sector, which we now call truckload general freight. And the truckload sector tends to be more and more full of companies that are running long haul operations, and a single driver has got to haul at the distance. So if you're going pull a load from Los Angeles to Chicago,
Yeah.
okay, you might have the first leg a driver might take, it would be to Las Vegas under the old system, and maybe he might pick up a trailer there and go right straight back to LA. But now the driver goes to Las Vegas himself, and then on through to Utah, and then on through to Colorado, and then on through, and now he's out there in Chicago and unloads the load. The worst thing that happens is when, after he gets out there, he doesn't have a load going back. So he
Right,
starts
yeah.
hunting around to find his freight.
And then if he doesn't get something, then there's an empty load, you know. Of course, he probably tries to stay there and pick up something to
Yeah.
have the load go
But
back.
that's actually an important part of the problem as well. So here he is out here in Chicago, and that's not his home base. His company's home base is in the West Coast. Their business density is not very high out in Chicago. So what do? They shop for freight, and they're willing to haul at a lower cost, generally speaking, out of Chicago because they just want to get out of there. They want to get back to the West Coast because that's where their primary business is. So they have to serve those customers as a primary basis. So they'll shop around for freight. And when they're shopping around for freight, that's called the back haul. There's a front haul or a revenue
Right.
haul where you're making money, and then there's the back haul. In the back haul, you're not making so much money.
You're lucky to
And-
cover the gas.
Well, that's the problem. And when you get to the point where you're scrambling just to cover the fuel, you may cover the fuel, you may cover some of the other costs, but you may not even cover any of the driver costs. So the driver, if he's an owner-operator, he might find himself working nearly for free, and certainly they don't end up with the kind of money they need in terms of their tariffs, in terms of their prices, their revenues, to support a decent wage all the way around.
Well, you mentioned about the truckloads. In the book, you talk about how after deregulation, you had basically two segments: the less than truckload, and then you had the truckload. And so there was kind of a reorganization of the whole trucking
That's
industry that happened as a result of deregulation.
Now, the whole industry got reorganized as a result of deregulation. You know, the whole idea of it was just to let the market take care of itself. But when the market took care of itself, was segment the industry into these specialized sectors. So what used to be the general freight sector collapsed into what is now just the less than truckload sector, the sector which once was a very specialized sector, hauling truckload freight, expanded very quickly because they could haul that freight, a whole truckload at a time. And this is something that's often hard to explain to people who are not part of this lingo. But a truckload is a single load of freight, which is a single shipment, which one shipper puts on a truck and sends to one consignee and one customer. And that's a truckload. With a truckload, you don't have to have a terminal. You don't have to have any intermediate operations. If you think about a less than truckload carrier, that's smaller shipments. The most obvious example of this that people understand is UPS. I mean, they're just little packages. So you might have 1,000 packages. That's 1,000 different shipments on one truck. It's still going to be one full truckload, but it's going to be 1,000 shipments. If you have 1,000 shipments, you have to have a terminal to sort that freight, to make sure that it goes on the right truck going to the right end destination. So that business still requires a very complex operation of feeder trucks, pickup and delivery trucks that bring the freight into a terminal, people who work on the dock who sort that freight and make sure it goes in the right trailer going to the customer in the end. And it'll go to some city across the country, but they'll be sorting it and putting it in that trailer for delivery across the country. But there may be many shipments in there, and that's a higher revenue business. There's a lot more revenue in that, and so far that's supported relatively higher wages, better conditions.
Well, and that was something implicit in here is how also you talk in the book about how the economic risk, has been shifted from employer to employee as part of deregulation.
Right. When you talk about shifting to a piecework system where people are not paid for their non-driving time, where they're just paid when the wheels are turning, then the risk shifts to the driver, because if the plant is not ready to ship the freight, the plant that ordered the truck to come and pick it up is not ready to ship it. When he gets there, he has to cool his heels. And he might be waiting for 2 hours, he might be waiting for 2 days. In either case, he's not going to be paid for that time. So the customers, the shippers, and the consignees tend to exploit the drivers, and they really exploit the whole trucking industry, all the companies themselves, because they whipsaw one company against another, one driver against another, and have done so to wipe out the ability of those carriers to collect on this wasted time, to get paid for this wasted time, which only encourages those companies to be even more inefficient. That is, since they're not, it's somebody else's money. You've heard that phrase, somebody else's money. This is like somebody else's time, somebody else's money. So a shipper wants to make sure that the truck is there when they're ready to deliver that, to ship that load, on Monday morning at 8 o'clock. But if it turns out that a Monday morning at 8 o'clock they're not ready, they can always tell the driver to wait. So Monday at 6 o'clock in the evening, they're finally ready to ship it. That means they haven't had to wait for that truck to get there, even though they weren't sure they would get that load ready between 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening. They weren't sure when it would get ready, but since we're not going to pay for the driver's time, we'll just have him be there from the minimum, the earliest time that we expect this is possible, and we'll have him wait until we're ready. I had a journalist call me up who'd done a ride-along with a truck, and a truck driver, and he was driving with a guy who was hauling watermelons. It's a great story. He was absolutely shocked. How did the guy handle a watermelon load? He pulled up to the farm field, stopped, and waited, and they harvested the watermelons and put them on the truck, one watermelon at a time.
Oh my.
And that driver spent an entire day waiting for them to load watermelons, one watermelon at a time. Can this happen in an efficient, well-functioning economic environment? Not a chance, because his time is worth something, the truck's time, the sitting time is worth something. There's capital being wasted, there's labor being wasted, and it's all being wasted because using market forces, these folks have been able to whipsaw people down and get them to essentially donate their time. It's just unbelievable.
Is it my imagination, or are some of these trucks getting bigger, longer, and
Well, that's true, too.
And they also have like 3-bottom trucks now that are whipping along the major tollways?
Certainly. That's really different. It's really not part of this research in the book, but in fact, there are more trucks now than ever because everybody wants it today. They want it yesterday, as we say. They want it fast. They want it cheap. They want it in a very reliable way. They want their shipments on time. Everybody goes up to their internet company and orders something, expects to see it show up on the doorstep the next morning. So there's more and more demand for trucks, more and more demand for drivers, more and more demand for bigger equipment to haul all this freight. And since 1980, the trucks have gotten larger. They have gotten heavier. Not a whole heck of a lot heavier. Probably the national legal limit has gone up about 10% in terms of weight. But they have gotten not only doubles, which have been around for a long time, but triples on some highways. If you go on the Ohio Turnpike, there you'll see them right there.
That's I don't know. To me, that's pretty unnerving to pass a truck in these.
Yeah.
3, in a row.
Right. Well, they're pretty careful. They're very regulated. They're only allowed to run them in certain times, and the companies that use them are those less than truckload carriers that usually, not always, but very frequently are unionized carriers. So they tend to have some of the best drivers that there are, and they have some pretty tight requirements as far as when they can use them. It's still unnerving to the driver, the motorist. But hey, during this past summer, which was actually their winter, I was in Australia giving testimony on this book, and I went to the Outback and saw what they call road trains. And those road trains
They're
are
even
much
longer?
bigger than ours.
Oh,
105 meters.
oh
105,
my.
longer than a football field.
Oh, my.
2-lane roads.
Now, is this just one truck, or is it
That's one. Well, it's a truck and 4 trailers.
4
A
trailers?
truck and something called a B-double, and then 3 trailers behind that. I was pretty impressed. They were big. And big kangaroo bars on the front to keep the kangaroos out of
Kangaroo
the way.
off them, yeah.
That's right.
So they must have video cameras or something to watch the end of that one.
Oh, you just give it up. You can't back it up anyway, so there's nothing to watch behind you. And anybody who tailgates one of those has to have his head examined anyway.
Yeah,
So.
because it'd probably take them forever to stop, like the entire length of Australia.
I was quite impressed by them. Actually, I was following one of them down the Stewart Highway, which is the track out in the outback, at about 100 kilometers an hour, and he started wiggling on the road, and I thought it was dusk. I thought, oh, he's going to fall asleep. The thing jiggled out of the middle of the road, and it jiggled like that, and he honked his horn. And I thought, oh, no, it's happened. And a steer jumped out from in front because they don't fence the range out there. This is just like the Wild West, it's a wild scene. But they are bigger, even bigger than ours.
Well, and one of the things you point out at the end of your book is, that this does raise some issues. I mean, to think about, if you have this model of deregulation, about where is this nation going? Are we going toward the high road of good jobs and value-added production? Are we faced really toward a decline, toward a low road of bad jobs and a devalued economy?
I think we're going down both roads, and perhaps that's what makes me most concerned. Because we have a high-tech road, we have the high-flyer road, and even with the current hiccup in the stock market, we know that the high-tech industry will bounce back. And that's certainly an industry where money is being made, people are putting a lot of value in, and a lot of investment and so forth. But there's also another side. Since 1981, when Ronald Reagan took over, there's been a widening split between the haves and the have-nots.
Well, thank you for being on Rip
You're
Rap.
welcome.
That's Michael Belzer.